Welcome to the second half of our session on the Connected Skies Summit, I guess, part of the overall Connected Places Summit. So we've spoken about airports welcome back online as well. Thank you for coming along. So we've spoken about airports as places, as cities. We've spoken about the future of air mobility. We've looked at the infrastructure that supports that. So what we're going to look at now is about zero emission flight. So how do we decarbonize aviation? So what is that zero emission flight? What does that look like? What are the pieces that we need to bring together to make that? And then we'll have a final look, which will be looking at the legacy of a really important program that we have in the UK, which is the Future Flight Challenge. But for this session, which is looking at zero emission flight, I've got Tim and I've got Sophie on stage. So I'm going to ask you if you could introduce yourselves and then we'll get into the questions.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. My name's Tim Johnson. I'm the Strategy Director at the CAA, the UK Aviation Regulator and sponsor of our sustainability programme.
Thank you.
I'm Sophie Lane. I'm the Chief Relationships Officer at the Aerospace Technology Institute. So we're a grant funding organisation supporting R&D in commercial aviation.
That's great, thank you. I have a series of questions pre-prepared, but if you do have any questions, please use the Slido link and we'll hopefully be able to ask those questions on your behalf. But we'll start with my questions. So earlier Emma Gilthorpe was speaking on the main stage and she spoke about the construct of the Jet Zero Council, including the formation of the Zero Emission Flight Delivery Group. So what I'm interested to know is what are your roles in the delivery group for your organisations? Tim.
Okay, thank you. So the Zero Emission Flight Delivery Group has three parts to it: an airline part, infrastructure, including airport part, and a regulation subgroup. I'm chair of the regulation subgroup. Our mission really is to think about what the regulatory framework is that would enable zero emission flight, particularly hydrogen, but also electric, and think about how we develop that regulatory framework in tandem with the technology. Over time, we've got a good range of participants from other regulators, such as the Health and Safety Executive. We've got sort of members of industry in different parts of the hydrogen supply chain, as well as some sort of academics and colleagues from the CAA as well.
Great, thank you.
And I sit in the aircraft technology subgroup, as well as on the ZEFI. So within aircraft technology, what we're looking at is the potential entry into service of aircraft, what scenarios might drive or accelerate that, what that means for future demand of fuels, and what technologies we need to invest in order to be able to accelerate the benefits of these new zero emission aircraft when they come into service.
Great, thank you. And just for the record, I sit on the Zero Emission Flight Delivery Group infrastructure subgroup, so you've got all angles covered, all three of us now. So what I'm interested to know, perhaps the next move is moving on from that, is to look at what the challenge is and what the sort of things for zero carbon flights that we're looking at within the delivery group itself. So perhaps starting with Sophie, look at the things perhaps on the aircraft side of things in particular that we're focusing on in there.
Yeah, so the Aerospace Technology Institute chairs the aircraft subgroup because we're really looking at the technologies that need to be developed in order to bring zero emission flight at a commercial scale to the industry. We're looking at what technologies need to be developed in what time scales, and we're responsible for delivering some of that R&D funding on behalf of the UK government and in partnership with industry. So as part of the subgroup, one of the things that we've been looking at is what is achievable in the next 5 years. In terms of technology and in terms of development, what are the constraints that we're facing, what do we need from the infrastructure and the regulatory sector, and what more can we be doing to try to ensure that the barriers that exist currently to technology development are addressed as far as possible to stimulate the demand and to encourage the investment that's needed. So quite a broad spectrum spectrum. In particular, we've been focusing on different scenarios for entry into service to look at what that does to our sustainability modelling and the government's sustainability modelling, and then using the results of that to start to allow us to compare similar issues across different scenarios and see what impact that has on net zero 2050.
Great. And Tim?
Yep. So on the regulation group, we are looking at what changes to the existing regulatory framework will be needed to enable these technologies to come into service. Two kind of main areas, I guess. Firstly, aircraft themselves. There's obviously a sort of well-established kind of global certification framework for aircraft, ultimately set at a principal level, at an ICAO level, which is the kind of global aviation regulator. And we're looking at what evolution to that existing framework is going to be needed to enable some of these aircraft to be certified. We have got, particularly in the UK, we've got organisations like Zero, Avia and Cranfield who are developing smaller scale sort of aircraft and developing their technology, and Zero, Avia in particular have had a permit to fly and been able to do some trials. So some of the work of the group is saying, well, what can we learn from both what the R&D programs that industry are undertaking, particularly the aerospace sector is undertaking, as well as some of those live trials, and say, well, actually, how do we evolve this framework over time? Secondly, for ground-based infrastructure, which is partly a CAA have an interest as an aviation regulator, but much of what happens on airports is covered by the health and safety executive regime for the handling of sort of storage, transportation of materials. So the sort of regulation part of the group that's supporting the airports is working with HSE to say, well, actually, what have we got in place already? How do we need to evolve that going forward? And recognising probably at this stage no one's got sort of perfect foresight about what the aircraft or the operations will be, but I think our approach very much is how do we get on the path, how do we allow some testing, some demonstrators, how do we then think about scaling it up before we get to sort of sustainable operations. So recognise there's a pathway there. We're not going to get out there all in one go, but recognising the sort of the pace and the ambition partly set by government, but partly set by the industry itself. Our objective very much is to sort of keep the regulation or the regulatory thinking and the frameworks developing in parallel with the sort of R&D programme. One of the things that we hear a lot from industry is, please can you tell us what the regulatory framework is, and then we'll design our technology to suit that. I'm not sure that's necessarily the best way of doing that, because I think regulators don't have perfect foresight either. You will, as developers, the sector will have R&D programs, and we'll be trying things. Some things will work, some things will need to be adapted. So we don't want to set the regulatory regime too early, hence that sort of iterative approach.
Thank you. On the infrastructure side, because you asked, what we're looking there is actually looking at what the infrastructure will look like for zero-emission flights. That's building on work on the work of ATI produced on FlyZero program, looking at things like Project Napkin, which was part of the Future Flight Challenge, but also a piece of work that Connected Places Catapult involved in called ZEFI, which is the Zero Emission Flight Infrastructure Program, which is looking at what the infrastructure will need for hydrogen and electric powered flight. So we've defined a blueprint, a roadmap, and we've done a number of demonstrations showing some of those early technologies, and we've recommended some a proposed R&D program to take that forward. And some of the work we're doing in the delivery group is actually looking at what the R&D is going to be required, but also the steps in which we can transition to zero emission flight for the infrastructure perspective, so we can actually support these aircraft themselves. So that's just so you've got the context of where we're covering. So we are covering the regulatory, the aircraft, and also the supporting infrastructure. And there's also going to be the setting up of commercialisation working group, and there's been some work behind the scenes on that, which we've been involved in as well, which is looking at how can we commercialise all this technology, the business itself, and how we make that work, and looking at what it's looked like overseas and comparing ourselves with that. So in that context, so it's interesting about the regulatory side of things. So what you've mentioned some of the work you're doing with the HSE and others, but what are the actual regulatory challenges? Is it the fact that I mean, is it something that you mentioned about the fact that it's expected that the regulations will be there and everyone will just follow you and that's what we need, or is it a case that the industry actually needs to go a little bit ahead of what you're doing so you can actually understand where sort of the direction of travel is going and then collaborate to develop those regulations? Do you see that?
I think a much more kind of collaborative approach of those two scenarios that you describe. As I said before, we don't have kind of perfect foresight. Industry is doing the sort of R&D and the technical development, and our ambition absolutely would be to not our job to be kind of responsible for the kind of technology, but go on the journey, understand the technical development programs, understand what problems they're trying to sort of address or what safety evidence those programs are trying to test, make sure we understand those. Maybe we'll have some views that we can input on the sorts of testing that might be done that will be ultimately sort of helpful. So I think we'd absolutely regard it as a sort of partnership, if you like, both parties playing their roles. But I think as I think actually aviation has demonstrated over many decades, and particularly with large commercial air transport, you know, the regulatory framework has developed, and the relationship between the manufacturers and the regulators has been a sort of appropriate one, but necessarily kind of open and transparent, and very much with two-way dialogue at the heart of it.
Yeah. Do you see a role, as with standards development, though, for industry to be involved in helping draft some of those regulations as well?
Yes, I think consistent with what exists already in aviation and other sectors. If there are parts of the system, whether that's ground-based infrastructure or on aircraft where kind of standards can be developed, then I think that's part of the overall assurance regime that regulators can look at and say, well, actually, this component or this part of the service or this part of the infrastructure is covered by a standard, and we can place a degree of reliance on that rather than having to repeat that. So part of that overall sort of macro assurance framework about the end-to-end service.
Right, thank you. So Sophie, on the aircraft side of things, what's happening there? Sorry, it's a really big question, sorry. I mean, where are we with developing the zero-emission aircraft? I mean, where are we on that journey, I guess?
Well, so you've heard a lot about what's happening with electric vehicles already. Tim has mentioned ZeroAvia, who flew earlier, we're in the next year now, January last year, and were able to show what they could do with their technology, and that's a hybrid fuel cell using hydrogen and electric. There is a lot of work going on in companies like Airbus, looking at a whole potentially hydrogen system. Rolls-Royce tested one of their engines on hydrogen earlier this year. There's a huge amount happening in zero-emission flight. And I think the thing that's clear is, given the long development times for aircraft, given that we are entering into essentially what is revolutionary development, we are going on a really long path, and we need to do that in partnership. So in aircraft technology terms, we don't know exactly what the best solutions are yet. There are a number of avenues that are being explored, lots of them being supported by organisations like the ATI. And we're learning, and companies are learning, and industry is working within the UK, but also in collaboration overseas, and seeing what's happening there, and different development is happening there. So what we're really trying to do is reduce the amount of uncertainty in the future. But as Tim said, it's a journey, and that's why we have to go on it together. We can't give a clear view at the moment of exactly what the answer is, and it's likely there'll be a number of answers, and that will have potentially impact on how we fly, how airports operate, as well as the infrastructure, the regulation, and the technology. So there's a whole host of challenges, but it's this is technology that is happening today. It's not future thinking, and I was on a panel not very long ago where they said, is hydrogen flight wishful thinking? And I was just like, it's happening. This is something that we need to be aware of and looking at, and there are lots of challenges with it. but they're not, from my perspective, actually around the technology. I can see the technology pathway, but there are lots of challenges around the investment in everything that would be needed to actually get that aircraft off the ground.
Sure. And does some of the work you're doing, does that also look at the supply chain? Because obviously there's a lot of focus on the OEMs and their programs. So Airbus, you've mentioned already, and there seems to be a lot of focus about them, having aircraft available from 2035 and onwards. But what about in the UK for the supply chain? Because obviously we were very strong in the supply chain for non-zero emission flight aircraft. So what work are we doing there? Is it trying to develop business as normal, or is there other developments that we're seeing?
No, it's absolutely not business as normal. There's a huge number of startups coming into the industry, some from space, automotive, other areas. There are people applying AI in different ways. We are looking at new design, completely clean sheet design of aircraft. There are lots of people moving sectors, so potentially where they've been using electrical hydrogen in a different sector, and they're looking at how they can apply it. So there's a really complex supply chain developing, where you have your traditional players who've been in the industry for quite a long time, and you have a number of people who are coming in and bringing different skills and different perspective and different ways of working with them, and combining that and bringing together some of that innovation with some of the technology that already exists, and looking at how you can evolve that. And certainly a lot of evolution is happening in terms of the efficiency of aircraft, and that needs to continue, but then also looking at completely clean sheet designs, where you could really be much more radical, and there are lots of people coming to play in that space who maybe haven't operated in aviation and aerospace before, and who are seeking a lot more reassurance perhaps, but also trying to work out how to navigate our ecosystem. And so some of what we've been trying to do in technology terms is look at, well, what are the identifiable technology areas that we know the UK needs to develop a strength in, that we need to be able to operate in, and where are the areas that maybe we might want to collaborate, and actually we don't have as much depth there, so maybe there's something we can do with partners, either in other sectors or potentially overseas. And so as the technology develops, we're seeing different business models, we're seeing different partnerships develop, and we're also seeing people thinking very differently about how this technology will develop, and it's developing rapidly, and we're learning a lot, kind of year on year.
Sure, that's great, thank you. Just moving back to the regulatory side, you've just announced recently the CAA's Hydrogen Challenge. So how does that contribute to the work of the ZEF delivery group, or into zero emission flight generally, I guess?
So it absolutely supports the work of the group. So the CAA set up a Hydrogen Challenge with some financial support from the regulators' Pioneer Fund. So it's an 18-month programme, really to sort of help get some new technology testing done, again to help the thinking and understanding about the regulatory framework going forward. So it's been some sort of pump priming effectively for us, but its objectives and its purpose and the way it will work practically will be absolutely aligned to support the work of the Jet Zero Council. I think as earlier this week, the Hydrogen in Aviation Alliance published a really interesting report, different parts of the sector coming together saying actually these are things that need to happen to enable this technology to come to fruition. So I think really welcome this kind of contribution to the debate around that. That looked at a whole range of things like sort of skills and incentives and the sort of hydrogen production and how to make sure that is done in a sustainable way. I think really important. But part of that would be sort of how does the regulator become well enough resourced, particularly for some of these new technologies coming into the sector. They're not part of our existing funding model. So to particularly with these emergent sectors, sort of how we make sure we've got enough capacity and the finance to make sure we've got enough capacity to do this kind of thinking and development with the sector is an ongoing issue.
Sure.
I mean, government has actually been really good at sort of supporting some of that activity over time, but I think the question is how to apply some of those lessons in this hydrogen space, and I think we'll need some. I think we've made a good sort of down payment on getting on with that, but more capacity, and as other parts of the sector will find, accessing the skills that we all need and making sure there's a investment in the pipeline of skills from schools and universities and coming through, I think will be really important. Yeah. We're just as we're a part of that. The sector will always have more skills in sort of quantity terms than regulator, but we obviously want to make sure we've got enough of the right people.
Sure.
And I think if I can add to that,
please do.
That works really nicely alongside what we've been doing in the Hydrogen Capability Network, where we've been thinking about what does the test environment need to look like, what skills are we going to need, what materials might we need to use, where do we need to invest as a country in a capability in order to be able to sustain the industry, but also in the people to be able to generate the knowledge that's going to be needed, and it's knowledge that perhaps doesn't exist today anywhere, not in the UK. So as an industry, we're already facing a challenge with engineering skills. Actually going forward, that's only going to get worse. So we've been doing a project that looks at how can we invest alongside the government to start to address some of those areas that maybe otherwise wouldn't move as quickly as we need them to.
Right. I guess that's the next question I had really is really how do we compare with what's going on with overseas, and is there an opportunity, particularly in the global nature of what we're doing in aviation, to cooperate and probably collaborate more closely with our overseas neighbours? So the FAA, for example, on the aircraft side of things, or even with the EASA or other countries. I mean, do you have a view on that, on how that might work or how we are with that?
So, I mean, certainly on the R&D side, we work very closely with the FAA, who not only do certification but also do R&D. Yeah. So we work with the R&D side. We work with DLR, Honora, other organisations who are looking at zero emission flight, who are investing heavily in hydrogen capability, and in countries, particularly in Europe, where they have a history of hydrogen production at scale, whereas we don't have that here. Yeah. So in many ways, their testing environment might be more advanced than ours, but they haven't necessarily been looking at liquid hydrogen, which is what we're looking at for really commercial scale flight. So there are opportunities to learn from what's going on overseas. There are certainly investments being made. I think Duncan in the last session was essentially saying if we don't act now, we'll lose the opportunities overseas. That's definitely true in zero emission flight. It's definitely true in the hydrogen market. We've anticipated that the global market for aviation in 2050 will be somewhere in the region of £4.3 trillion. That's huge for us to potentially be able to take a large proportion of. There's an economic growth argument for investing in hydrogen, but we can't do everything. So learning from overseas, what are they doing already? Where are we going to be competitive? And really making our investments sensibly so that we can maximise the return to our industry, but also to the country.
Great. And what about for the regulatory side too?
Absolutely. I mean, aircraft can't fly outside the UK unless there's some kind of reciprocal agreement, and with other states, and that's partly the kind of philosophy behind the ICAO framework. So I think from our perspective, we absolutely would want to collaborate both in the development of the kind of regulatory frameworks with peers, America, some of the other Five Eyes countries, absolutely with EASA as well. Right. Partly from it's almost inevitable that we'll have to, so actually better to recognise that up front, but also just from a skills perspective as well, given this sort of strong market for hydrogen skills. I think regulators sort of sharing insights and expertise, I think, will really help advance that. I mean, I think we're finding, particularly on sustainability, but other areas as well, other regulators in other countries are very kind of keen to collaborate. There are some differences in those regimes. The technology is sometimes a bit different. How it flies in the outback in Australia is very different from central London, say.
Sure.
But actually, we're finding sort of the latent enthusiasm for collaboration is good.
Great, thank you. I think we'll move to Skipso. There's quite a few interesting questions coming up on there,
Okay.
so be prepared. So one of the questions that we have here, and it's relevant to both the regulatory side and also for the aircraft development side. So what are the learnings from the use of liquid hydrogen from other industries, and how can we bring those into aviation regulation and for aircraft operations, allowing a faster route to certification whilst keeping safety as a #1 priority? The questions come, so an example is things like inspection from oil and gas and space, so they're likely to be very common to aircraft.
So, I mean, space is the obvious example, but it's very different. You don't fly your rockets multiple times. You're looking at something slightly different in terms of what you're trying to achieve. One of the reasons we set up the Hydrogen Capability Network was because of the lack of knowledge around the handling, the storage, the use of liquid hydrogen, and how what we would need to be develop to be able to use that as effectively and efficiently as possible. And part of that is learning from other sectors to the extent that they use it.
Yes.
But it's used in a very different way, and actually not at scale. One of the bigger problems we're going to have in the UK is actually getting access to liquid hydrogen, producing it, liquefying it. These aren't easy things to do. It takes an enormous amount of energy. It takes an enormous amount of space. So we're going to need to work out what the demand is and how we use it. And in many ways, that's quite far off. Not in technology terms. In technology terms, it's like that. But actually, in practical terms, it's a while before the demand really grows and before we actually are using this at scale. So we're doing what we can to learn from those who do use it, but it's not very many. And also to understand how we build those skills so that we know how to use it effectively. Sure. Because there aren't a lot of people that we can just go out and employ. Yeah. These are people we're largely going to have to train. Yeah.
What about from the regulatory side of things, Tim? Is there things that we can learn from other industries and perhaps adapt some of the...
Absolutely. I mean, other utilities, oil and gas might be one, for example. The space sector, I mean, we're also the UK space regulator, so there's some sort of carryover there.
Yeah.
I think HSE have got a really fundamental role. They've got quite a big hydrogen R&D programme that they're running out of their, I think, Derbyshire facility, Buxton, which I think is at some scale, and there are things like that we sort of really need to sort of, and indeed are tapping into and making sure we can make the most of those.
Sure.
But also applies domestically and internationally as well. The point I made earlier.
No, absolutely. So another question we have. It'd be interesting to see what you have to say on this one. So this is an area where there's significant advances in other modes of transport. So how can we better work across those modes of transport to share learnings and potential applications? Perhaps you'd like to start, Sophie.
Yeah, so with gaseous hydrogen, which is what other modes of transport are looking at, we can certainly work together and look at that. And in the short term, actually, that will be about getting access to the hydrogen at a competitive and commercially viable price, and being able to learn from that and use that. But what we discovered in the FlyZero project that you talked about earlier is that gaseous hydrogen, because it takes up more space, I'm going to apologise to any hydrogen engineers or any scientists here, because I'm going to do this very basically, because it takes up more space. Actually, you can't have that as your primary fuel source on a narrow body or a wide body aircraft. So if you're going to want to fly at distance, then you've got to be talking about liquid hydrogen, which is cryogenically frozen in order to make it liquid, which means it takes up less space in your aircraft, it's more efficient, but actually no one else uses that, partly because it's got to be cryogenically frozen, and that's quite difficult.
Sure.
So, you know, there isn't a huge amount on the liquid side that we can bring across, but certainly working with maritime and with automotive around gaseous and what's happening there, and watching with interest about the use cases.
Sure, sure. And from yourself, Tim?
I think probably very similar. There will be some things that we can learn from other sectors, and it's about finding the mechanisms to do that, but also recognising that aviation is different, just the temperature differentials between pressure differentials between the ground and a cruise level, you know, a different set of kind of operating kind of conditions there. And I think the other key point is aircraft. You then need the infrastructure and the support infrastructure at the other end of the at the other end of the flight, and there will be kind of different regimes attaching there. So thinking about how do we learn kind of cross-modally, but also from other countries, and recognising, you know, their kind of interdependencies as well.
Great, thank you. So we have actually run out of time before my last question.
Already?
So yeah, I know it whizzes by. So thank you very much indeed. It was absolutely really interesting conversation. So ladies and gentlemen, please thank Tim and thank Sophie for all your input. That was great.
Thank you.